welcome to the Business Intercept, where I try to bring you interesting stories based on business, how it can affect you, our economy. You don't have the time to always find these stories on your own, and sometimes when you hear the major news and it happens to be in it, you might not always understand or even really have a chance to sit down and really gather your thoughts about how it could affect you on a day-to-day basis. So that's really what I try to do here at the Business Intercept. That's really the concept of the show and of this channel. If you like what you hear or you find something interesting, please make a comment below. Hit the subscribe button if you find this useful, and hit the notification bell because that allows you to know when new videos come out. So, as you can already see on the right hand side here, I have a story that we're going to talk about that really is not, at first glance, a business story. But trust me, it is, because we're going to relate this to what I really want, or what our main topic is going to be in this particular video. So let's take a look. This is a story that came out over the weekend on Fox News. Minneapolis police offer advice on how to stay safe during the crime surge. So we all know we've got COVID going on. And when that started, people started really going crazy. I'm sure you remember all of the people getting in arguments and fights over toilet paper. People buying masses and masses of it. Okay? Those arguments have switched from toilet paper now to, do you have your mask on or don't you have your mask on? And a lot of unrest because of that. Then the killing of George Floyd hit, and from that point on, we've had calls for the defunding of the police, calls for the reduction of police, and mass demonstrations. Demonstrations that have moved way beyond taking to the streets to demand police reform, to all-out riots in Portland and Seattle. Crime is up across the country, but particularly in these large cities. Minneapolis, where the killing happened, that is up. You've had to have seen the news with Portland, to the point where the president sent federal officers in there to protect the federal courthouse. The mayor and the governor of Oregon didn't want them to do that. They wanted to just let the people there. We had the CHOP situation where they created their own little community without police. And throughout this whole situation, over the last 4 or 5 weeks, crime has been steadily going up. Okay? There have been a number of unfortunate deaths that have happened in the wake of these riots. I think we're up to probably 30 deaths as a result of the riots that originated through Black Lives Matter. Now, to be fair, the Black Lives movement, if you want to call it that, the whole movement to protest police brutality as a result of what we saw on camera happened to George Floyd, that has been co-opted in many ways by other groups. I talked about how labor unions are co-opting the movement to try and get higher wages at fast food restaurants, and get the fast food restaurant employees to unionize, which, whether you believe in unionization or don't believe in unionization, it certainly doesn't have anything to do with police brutality. So someone can make the argument that there are agitators, both personal and professional, that have entered the fray, so to speak, and are co-opting the message and the marches to create a complete situation of chaos. That might be true. And in some ways, it certainly is true. What is also true is we have seen a number of city councils, a number of mayors who, either out of sheer cowardice, misunderstanding, poor judgment, whatever you want to call it, have called for not only defunding police, but reducing police forces, taking them out of the city altogether, as the council's been talking about in Seattle, as if that is going to help matters in terms of people's day-to-day lives, trying to just go to work, get their kids to go to school, figure out this whole COVID situation. All of that's going on. And among all that, so we've got some tips from the police over in Minneapolis. Okay? Now, before we get to that, it's interesting that they say 1/3 of the department might leave by the end of the year. So you might get a reduction in forces, so to speak, even without cutting the budget, because, you know, a lot of these guys are just, they're sick of it. You know, the ones that have already put in their time, the only reason they're still working is either because they're bored or because the longer they work, the way, you know, union contracts usually work with their pensions, once you get to the point where you're got a pension, the longer you work and the longer hours you work, your pension usually gets backloaded in terms of how much you get each month based on that versus over the course of your career. Certainly it's that way in New York and New Jersey. So there are a lot of guys, a lot of gals who are older, who could retire, who are still at the force for those reasons, and some of them, of course, believe in the calling of being a police officer, but they're over it. I mean, they're just like, they're not going to go through the aggravation. So a lot of them are going to leave. And we see this. This is talk about Minneapolis, but we see this in New York as well. So what are some of the tips that they're giving us? Well, let's see. They offered a helpful list. Some of the examples include carry only items that you need, and carry less cash. That was always a smart thing to do. Be prepared to give up your cell phone and your purse or wallet. Don't fight with a criminal. Remember, your safety is most important. And this is really important to think about in Portland, in Minneapolis, New York, because in all those places, having a gun is not easy to do. You can't even get a carry permit in New York for all intents and purposes. Like, you have to literally show, like, emails, text messages, you know, voicemail messages of your life being threatened before you can get a carry permit in New York City. So it's these tips, while they might sound ridiculous to someone in Florida or Texas, in a city where you can't necessarily carry a gun, or if you have one on you and someone attacks you and you use it to defend yourself, you end up in trouble, not the criminal. So these are not unreasonable tips to give, even though they do sound somewhat silly to me. Okay, so why do I bring this up? Why do I bring this up on the business channel? First, this is why, and I'm going to bring up this right here. As a result of all of this unrest, okay, first-time gun ownership is skyrocketing amid riots, increased violence across the country, and as one first-time gun owner says, you can never really be too safe. Now, let's read the story a little bit here. Young parents from California, not exactly known as a bastion for gun owners. Of course, since they live in California, you also don't want to use their last names. But basically, they sit with the country a little bit on edge right now. It was the right time to make their first gun purchase. The couple is among the horde of 2.5 million first-time gun buyers who have exercised their Second Amendment right to own weapons. They told Fox News that they have received their licenses and are now waiting for their firearms to arrive because, of course, they're on back order. With everything that's going on in the world and in politics and everything, you can't really be too safe. We have a family, a young family, so I think that's always at the back of my mind as well. I think with a lot of the riots and such like that, it's important to, if your First Amendment isn't protected, I guess you always have the Second Amendment, right? Well, that's what gun owners always say. Now, they don't really get into deep, political views, because for them, this is a non-political discussion. They're a young family. They probably had a discussion about the safety of that young family. And if you're going to discuss safety in a time where you've got riots and crime rising, a gun has to be part of the conversation. It just does. All right. And this picture right here, I think, is really the heart of a couple of different business stories that we're going to talk about all in this one video. The first, of course, being that record number of gun ownership. That means many gun shops are yet again having a record amount of sales in firearms. And I say again because I want you to think about this. Back during President Obama's term, gun sales went through the roof. Many gun manufacturers that were publicly traded, their stock went through the roof. Not only because of the things that the government was doing that made the stock market go up higher than the marketplace really justified, but also increased sales. So this is beyond even that, okay? More sales being even that situation. And of course, with everything that's going on, that makes sense. So you go into a lot of gun stores. You go into Academy Sports down here in Florida, which is a big box sports store. You go into the gun section, good luck. I mean, there's nothing there. It looks like this. I mean, this is what it looks like, okay? And it's that way elsewhere. You're literally waiting for ammunition to come in. As the COVID pandemic began, that first, I would say, middle of March through, I would say, the end of April, literally you would go to gun shops and be waiting in line 6 feet apart, 150 people back strong, waiting for that day's shipment of whatever ammunition that you could find. 9mm, 5.56, 22. They had nothing. It was just flying off the shelves, which is good in one case, because obviously more gun sales, that means the gun manufacturers, the manufacturers of ammunition, their sales are going up, meaning that even though we're having issues with the economy because of COVID, because they are a necessary business, they've got to meet those orders. But of course, the demand is so high that they can't get the guns made as quickly as they need to. Okay, so you see here, it says at the beginning of June, the National Shooting Sports Foundation announced that more than 2.5 million people have become first-time gun buyers in the first half of 2020. And so that's obviously a lot of money. I mean, just to kind of give you an idea, I'm just going to bring up, and this is just an average here. I'm just going to bring up a calculator real quick to make the point here. Come on, computer. Computers are so slow. So, I mean, if you've got 2.5 million, say the average gun sale is 500 and say $50, give or take. Just in gun sales alone, that's $1.3 billion in gun sales the first half of the year. That's just guns. That's not the ammunition that you need, the holsters that you need, the gun safe that you need, the classes that you need to take. And you do need to take them. You add those extra 4 things in, you're talking a lot of money at a time where many people are trying to conserve their money. But the situation in the country is such that people feel it necessary to go out and get a gun. If you're a first-time gun buyer, then I think it's a safe assumption to say that you're probably not a Republican. I mean, if you're a strong conservative, you've already got a gun. You probably got 3 or 4. So these, I mean, they don't really get into this, but I think it's important for something we're going to talk about in a second here. These are probably people who are either independent to more Democrat-leaning individuals, and they feel the need to take money that they might be thinking they need to save because of the economic situation, that they might need to use for child care if their kids end up not being able to go back to school, and they're getting firearms because they're that worried by what they see on the news. Okay? So, that's the backdrop. That's one business story itself. The amount of money that's being generated, let me again look at this, $1.3 billion in just game, and I'm just averaging up. You know, it could be out at a lot more if they're buying obviously higher end firearms, okay, and all the other things that you have to go with it. But even with that, look what's happening to this particular company, Remington Arms. Okay, despite surging gun demand, they're going to declare bankruptcy for the second time in like 2 years. Okay, you've got unprecedented gun demand, and one of the most storied gun manufacturers, as American as American Pie, are declaring a chapter bankruptcy reorganization yet again. Let's read the beginning. Firearms maker Remington Arms filed for bankruptcy protection for the second time since 2018. That's 2 years. Weighed down by more debt than it can repay, even as fearful Americans buy more guns than ever. Remington, which supplies hunting weapons for, of course, hunting, shooting sports, law enforcement, military, sought Chapter 11 protection and will try to sell its businesses at a time when civil unrest and worries about personal safety have driven firearm sales to record highs. Okay, the bankruptcy petition is in the state of Alabama, and when it filed for Chapter 11 in 2018, it transferred ownership at that time to investors including Franklin Resources and J.P. Morgan and Chase. And this right here is a bit of a surprise, and I'll tell you why. Because woven into all of this is, as much as gun sales are exploding, gun sales are still curtailed downward from where it could be because of two things. The first is you can't sell what you don't have in stock, right? They say in business that the hardest part of an expanding business is having product. If your business is expanding too fast, meaning you're getting more sales than you have the ability to meet, it's a problem. Okay, this happens in other areas when, say, a small toy maker gets put into Walmart or Costco, and all of a sudden their biggest problem is they can't make the orders for those companies, and they've got to go out and get investors or loans like that. And that last part of the sentence, loans, is what we're going to talk about in a second. But the second thing that's been tapping it down is one of the quiet stories that's been going on in the country for the last 3 or 4 years is that many financial institutions are beginning to not process transactions for gun shops and gun manufacturers. PayPal won't. There's a number of other, I can't think of the name right, but there's another one that competes with PayPal, begins with an S. They won't as well. Not Morgan Chase, but there's another big finance, Bank of America. They're beginning to not do it as well. So what's happening is companies have been trying to scramble and shift around ways to get not only funding and short-term loans so that they can, make the product, meet payroll, and do the things they need to do in order for the business to operate. But also the gun owners are having problem getting credit card processing and debit card processing because there is a huge push to essentially the people who don't like guns have decided that they're going to take advantage of these financial institutions, which are based mostly in New York, and skew more to the Democrat left-leaning side as a way to put a stoppage on the gun industry and gun rights, since they can't get anything through Congress. It's underhanded, it's sneaky, but strategically, you can't get mad at the strategy. It's smart. Okay, if you didn't have that, then we could be seeing even more sales going on right now. Okay, so that J.P. Morgan Chase, another financial institution, would be even interested in being a part investor owner of a gun maker. Again, I find somewhat surprising. Now, it says here, of course, that they've been looking for potential buyers. At one point, they were talking about possibly selling to the Navajo Nation, which is, obviously the nation of indigenous American Indians, as I like to call them, because I'm from the 70s. But negotiations collapsed in recent weeks, leaving the company without a lead bidder. Okay, so look, we could really see Remington go away if someone doesn't buy them. And this brings me to the question of why. In a time when you got so much demand, if someone goes into just about any gun store and asks for a shotgun, Remington's going to be one of the ones that the people at the gun store mention that the people should look at. Guaranteed. They just will. But they can't make enough sales. And here's the reason why. Debt. Okay? Let me go back to this. Where would it say here? Here. It is weighed down by more debt than it can repay. Debt is not just the bane of individuals' lives. This is, what they talk about so often on the Dave Ramsey show, right? Don't go into debt. Get rid of credit cards. Save your money up and pay for it that way. Now, that's a little bit easier to do as individuals than with a business. Because if you are a business and you go viral, you end up on the news, you end up on Oprah's best things list. You've got so much demand, your bank account doesn't have the money in it to manufacture, ship, and do all the things that you need to do in order to meet those orders. So what companies do, particularly companies that are manufacturers, so have to sink a lot of money into equipment, insurance, and things of that nature, they get loans. They bring in investors, they get loans, whether it's a loan from a bank, some sort of loan from investors. If you're a larger company, you might go into offer some sort of corporate bond. Any number of different financing ways that you can do in order to have the cash flow to go out and support the business as it expands. But if you go into too much debt, then you have the same problem as an individual that's got too much credit card debt. You got more obligation than you have sales, and at some point you just run out of credit. And at that point you've got two choices. You either go out of business completely, or you do what most large businesses do, which is you set up Chapter 11 and do a reorganization of the debt itself. which means your investors are probably going to take less money, or they're going to renegotiate the terms in which maybe they might get larger points on the back end. The loan might be almost like a refinance on your loan. The way people refinance with their houses, it might be something similar, but on a larger scale, obviously, in which the loan becomes larger, with maybe lump sum payments somewhere in between. You do a lot of different things in order to try and reorganize in such a way that you can remain in business, come out of Chapter 11, and now you're a much healthier, at least on the paper, than you were when you went into Chapter 11. Now, obviously, sometimes investors take a bath, sometimes they don't. Again, this is a business strategy more than anything else. However, when you have a company like Remington here, in which it is doing this the second time in 2 years, that tells me one of two things. One, the terms for the original reorganization weren't very good for them. B, it was a short-term situation that they thought that if they reorganized, they would look more attractive to a future buyer, that they could then go out and sell the company and then pay off most, if not all, of the reorganized debt. What's the lesson here in business and as an individual? And it's simple. Don't go into too much debt. Now, on a personal basis, that means, look, you might need to get a loan to buy a $400,000 house, particularly if you only make $40,000 or $50,000 a year, right? But you don't need to put $5,000 on your credit card for a vacation. You don't need to buy that large screen TV on your credit card. You don't need to put all sorts of things on your credit card as an individual. In business, the lesson is somewhat the same, which is you always have to watch how much debt you have, because you never know when you're going to run into a poor economy or a slow sales cycle. The gun industry is very competitive. Remington is a storied manufacturer, but they are not the only one. And part of the problem, I'm sure, is some of their other offerings, whether it's in rifles or 1911s or whatever the case may be, might not be competing as well against other companies like Smith and Wesson or H&K or any number of ones. Okay, again, there are a lot of good gun manufacturers out there, both in the U.S. and foreign. It's a crowded marketplace, and so you have to keep that in mind as well. But when you have a crowded marketplace, and if you have a downturn in the economy and your debt's too high, you're going to have problems. Another example of this is AMC Theaters. Because of coronavirus, AMC Theaters was literally not looking at just bankruptcy, but looking at like for real bankruptcy. Like Chapter 11 isn't real bankruptcy. That's a reorganization. You get to talk to your investors, but you're still in business. Your doors are not closing. You're not selling everything in the warehouse. Chapter 13 is when you have to sell everything and the business no longer exists. AMC was looking at Chapter 13 because quite literally a couple years ago, they had redid new debt. They've got new debt to upgrade their theaters. They put in new debt to upgrade their Movie Pass program. They had a lot of new programs that they financed through loans and investors that were setting themselves up for the future. Smart play, except they forgot one thing. You never know what's going to happen to the economy. And certainly, no matter what happens to the economy, it's easy to say people still go to church, people still go to the movies, People still go to the bars and buy beer. Except we're in Corona town now, and you can't go to the movies, you can't go to church, and you can't go to the bars. So now what? You're in an emergency without any cash flow. And as I've mentioned in some of my other videos, AMC, on their leasing alone, just where their theaters were at the malls, the shopping centers across the country, they were spending $250 million in leasing fees per quarter. Per quarter. That's $1 billion out of the bank every year just for the real estate that your theater's on. That's not salaries. That's not insurance. That's not utilities. That's not the popcorn that's overpriced. That's not the Coke that's overpriced. That's not the $6, pretzels. I mean, all that stuff you have to do too, right? And now there's no one in the theater. So granted, you don't have to buy your supplies, but you still got your insurance, and wasn't nobody trying to not take their monthly leasing payment from AMC. So they were in a true emergency and were looking at not being in existence again. In business, if you are particularly a small business, loans from a bank or from investors at times become necessary, but always try to do as much as possible without them, because you never know what the future is going to hold, and you have to have something in the tank to try and get you through when there's a downturn, whether it's lawsuit, downturn in the economy, a pandemic that you never thought about, whatever the case may be. There's always, as a financial advisor, when I worked at Merrill Lynch and Charles Schwab, one of the things that we always talked about when we sat down with a potential new client, and we kind of investigated what they were doing, where their assets were, did they have any investments, what their debts were. We always wanted to also know how much did they have as an emergency fund. And if they didn't have an emergency fund, we would tell them, at least good investors or good financial advisors would tell the clients, forget about the mutual fund, forget about the stocks. Other than your 401k at work, the first thing you need to do is get a 3-month emergency fund. That's the first thing you do. You don't do anything else until you do that. And then once you do that, you get things like insurance in place because you need some protections. And then your next thing is to try to get at least 6 months worth of living expenses. The best case scenario is for everybody to have at least a year's worth of expenses saved as an emergency fund. Not easy to do, but not impossible. Now, individuals are not companies. It's different. I get that. Nonetheless, if you don't want to go into bankruptcy, then you have to think about that as well. What is your emergency plan? And one of the things that Corona is really teaching everybody, large and small, is that you need to be prepared, because part of the reason that the economy is in such tatters isn't just governors, and everybody saying don't go to work, stay home, shutting the economy down. It's also that many of these businesses can't operate beyond a month or two in terms of their cash flow. They can't, and that's a problem. That's a problem both now and when this situation ends, as it surely will eventually. That's a problem then. If you're a business owner now, you need to start making your plans for how you survive not only today, but the emergency that happens in the future. That's going to be it for this particular video. If you have any comments or questions, Again, please put them down below.